Was the use of the atomic bomb justified? A question debated for over 80 years. The two main arguments people present are the bombings caused unnecessary death, killing over 200,000 people, many being ordinary citizens, and that the bombings stopped the war and possibly saved thousands of more people from dying on either side because of the Japanese' unwillingness to surrender. To understand why this has been such a long-standing debate, we must look at the different perspectives of this story. Films on the subject and historical documentaries can aid in a visual understanding. An essential question to be asked is, why did the Americans develop the atomic bomb in the first place? There are three main reasons. 1. To get the A-bomb before the Nazis and possibly use it in Europe. 2. To achieve the atomic feat before the Soviets and be ahead of them. And 3. To be the most powerful nation in the world. Before dropping the bomb, the Japanese fighting in the war displayed unwillingness to surrender or give up the fight, usually using everything they possibly could until they were killed by the Allies or by themselves. The Americans saw their opportunity to use the weapon they had been developing for many years. Germany had surrendered by June of 1945, so the bomb wasn't needed at all in Europe. The problem of Japan arises as the main target. The war for Japan was looking futile, and they were desperate to protect their homeland. Fighting tooth and nail, the Americans knew they would lose thousands or hundreds of thousands of soldiers on the Japanese mainland if a ground invasion were to occur, not to mention the tremendous amounts of casualties on the Japanese fighting side. When the ground invasion was seen to be the only solution to ending the war, the US forces dipped their atomic hand in the war. On August 6th of 1945, the Enola Gay dropped the uranium trigger bomb named the Little Boy on Hiroshima. The blast was equal to 15,000 tons of TNT. The bomb was dropped at 8:16 a.m. Japanese time. Although it was now known what the American government could do, the Japanese resisted the surrender request, and 3 days later, on August 9th, the US continued their nuclear war. At 11:01 a.m., the Boxcar B-29 bomber dropped the implosion-type plutonium bomb nicknamed the Fat Man on Nagasaki. This bomb had a force of over 21,000 tons of TNT. From the bombing of both cities, as few as 110,000 people and as many as 230,000 people died because of the initial blasts and various radiation effects and other wounds after the fact. The war was over, but at what cost? The nearly 600,000 people combined experienced things no one has ever before. Was all of this worth the Japanese surrender? Let's look at the yes side first. People who say yes usually fit into two different categories. The first being those that believe it to be justified because of Japan's previous war crimes, and 2, those that believe it saved thousands of American lives and possibly more Japanese lives. The people in the first group often argue that the Japanese emperor and his followers had it coming because of what they did to POWs and atrocities they committed around the world. Surrender was seen as the lowest possible thing a person could do, thinking that it would stain and dishonor a family's name. Because of this, Americans were treated worse than the farm animals in Japan and the captured colonies. Prisoners were routinely beaten and mistreated, barely being served any food at all, and mostly all medical needs being ignored. Even when prisoners were given Red Cross attention, drugs and medical supplies were removed from their treatment completely. Americans will look at the attack on Pearl Harbor, the very reason that the United States joined World War II, both in the Pacific and Europe. Though they may have joined at a later date, the fact that the Japanese attacked first and inadvertently caused American men to go off and die at war may be a reason for justifying the dropping of the bombs. Though this video has the goal to remain neutral in all parties, the issue of Japanese-American internment should be placed within this group as well. The growing racism towards Japanese citizens and fear of spies dealt a great injustice to Japanese Americans by holding them in camps for up to 3 years against their will. This group, in my respective opinion, would be the most likely to justify this action, which should not be justified. There is nothing wrong in believing the atomic bomb droppings were justified because of Pearl Harbor and POW treatment, but there is in believing Japanese internment was simply okay. Others cite the rape of Nanking, one of the most horrific and truly beast-like acts humans have ever committed. Over a 6-week period, starting in December of 1937, over 200,000 people were mercilessly massacred, 60,000 women were raped, and 35,000 prisoners of war were killed, all in Nanking, China. This event cemented the brutality of the Imperial Army and the measures that they would take for conquest. It should also be mentioned about the cannibalism of POWs, the false surrender and ambush of American troops, and the chemical weapons used on both soldiers and civilians. The other group focuses on the positive side of possibly saving lives of all kind, rather than the destruction that had already come before. Do you remember what was previously said about how the Japanese view the act of surrendering? This is the main player in this conversation. The Allies, mainly American forces, knew they were going to win the war, but didn't know how many more men it would take before they did so. Many argue that if the atomic bombs were not dropped, a ground invasion would have been necessary to force the Japanese surrender and end the war. It is estimated that if a ground invasion were to happen, anywhere from 250,000 to 1 million people would have died on the Allied side alone. Speculation tells us that around 3.5 million possible soldiers would have fought to the death, and many civilians would have been caught in the crossfire. But it is truly known about the estimates for how many Japanese would have died. For the sake of this video, let's estimate that 2.5 million soldiers on the Japanese side were killed, plus an additional 500,000 civilians. Then let's add the 500,000 American soldiers. That is around 3.5 million people versus the 225,000 people that were killed in the atomic bomb blasts. Now for the main two arguments against the dropping of the bombs. 1. The dropping of nuclear weapons on anyone is immoral, especially when dropped on civilians. And 2. An offshore test would have had the same effect and forced the Japanese to surrender without the death. The first group looks at the devastating aftermath of the people and cities where the bombs were dropped. Hardly any building or vegetation was left standing. The blast crumbled all that was in its pathway. People of all kinds were killed in an instant. With one flash, they were gone. The others that survived suffered the fate of the heat and radiation. Skin and clothing became one. Blood pouring from all the wrong places. Sicknesses that couldn't be treated. Life in Hiroshima and Nagasaki hadn't just ended, but stopped. Everything was nothing. The other group has a less complex view on the matter. They believe that lives could have been spared altogether if the bombs were just shown to the world instead of used on it. If the Japanese would have seen that the Americans have the power to blow away entire cities, they would have surrendered, and no one else would have died. So who is correct? They all are. Everybody makes valid points for both sides. It is up for you and everyone else around you to form your own opinion and make your own arguments on whether it should have been used, but it's integral to understand that a nuclear bomb would have been used at a later time, if not in Japan. Would this have been better or worse? We will never know. It is my hope that nuclear weapons are only ever used as a deterrent, because you can't unpress the button. Thank you everybody, and have a great day.